I would never fall for the daughter of a servant, just a passing amusement. The man, surrounded by people toasting and laughing nearby, was aloof and dignified, carelessly dropping these words as if they meant nothing. I couldn't afford to play this game of love. Hugging my cheap birthday gift, I slipped away unnoticed. 2 years later, he clutched my hand tightly, the arrogance gone, replaced by desperation. Miranda, please, don't leave me again. Chapter 1. This time, our supplier in Hong Kong is a subsidiary of Tianshu Group. As the young master of Tianshu, Frank normally wouldn't be here, so his sudden appearance made the lively private room fall into a brief, uneasy silence. Unbothered, he casually handed his long black coat to his assistant and took the main seat, where moments earlier the supplier's manager had been holding court. Now, that same manager was piling on flattery with a sycophantic smile. When Lisa from the purchasing department whispered, "Oh my God, he's insanely handsome," I glanced up at him. He didn't seem to notice me, or maybe he'd simply forgotten. I looked away as if it didn't matter, though I felt as if he were looking at me. But when I glanced back with a slight frown, he was calmly conversing with the purchasing manager, polite yet exuding a detached coolness. My phone kept vibrating in my pocket. It was Lisa, raving about Frank's looks in our department chat. Since Lisa's fangirling tendencies were infamous, she could rave a 7 out of 10 guy into a 9, the group didn't believe her, and everyone had ed me for confirmation. Lisa gave me a pleading look, so I had no choice but to reply. "He's all right." Lisa immediately sent me a private message, practically losing her mind. "You call that level of handsomeness all right? You only have eyes for Grover, don't you?" I didn't bother to explain and left her on read. Frank's arrival was seen as a sign that our collaboration would succeed. Everyone left in high spirits, and Lisa was tipsy by the time we walked out. After I helped her into a car, a shadow suddenly appeared behind me. The man, with a straight face, said, "Miranda, CEO Frank would like to have a word with you." It was Frank's assistant, as expressionless as a robot and equally intimidating. "I don't know your CEO Frank," I said, turning to get into the car. He placed a hand on the door and, lowering his head, replied with a sigh. "Miranda, you know CEO Frank's temper. If you don't come, he'll come to you himself." Not wanting this to drag on, I finally nodded. Chapter 2. I woke Lisa and told her I had a quick matter to handle, asking her to call me once she got back to the hotel. A black Mercedes waited in the farthest corner of the parking lot, with a tall figure leaning against the hood, a faint glow of red between his fingers. He never used to smoke. I wasn't sure when he picked up the habit. But that had nothing to do with me. Under Cliff the assistant's expectant gaze, I took one step after another toward him. He looked up as I approached, snubbing out his cigarette with his fingers. Straightening up, he said without expression, "Don't you want to catch up with an old friend? Why the rush to leave?" Standing half a meter away from him, I felt no emotion. If he hadn't appeared tonight, we might never have met again. "We have nothing to discuss." He stared at me with intense eyes, his thin lips pressed into a cold line. Just as I thought he'd remain silent, he suddenly asked, "Why did you leave 2 years ago?" 2 years ago. He still had the nerve to ask. Remembering those dark days, my anger, worn down by 600 days and nights, flared up again. I replied bitterly. "What were we, exactly? Do I owe you an explanation? What were we?" Frank let out a sudden, icy laugh, striding up to stand right in front of me. A head taller than me, he looked down, radiating an overwhelming intensity that made me take a step back. But he seized my hand, his voice low and tense. "Miranda, I was your boyfriend. You left without warning. What did you take me for? Boyfriend? What a joke." I tried to pull my hand away but failed, so I forced myself to act indifferent. Did that mean anything? Weren't we just having fun? Having fun? Frank froze, his thin lips parted slightly, his eyes rimmed with red. His pale skin made this change painfully obvious, and I was momentarily stunned. What was he playing at? Who knows why young Master Frank has always enjoyed messing with me, the servant's daughter. But I didn't have the patience for this. Just as I was about to demand he let go, my phone rang. Thinking it was Lisa calling to let me know she'd arrived safely, I glanced at the screen and saw the words CEO Grover flashing instead. A bit puzzled, why was he calling this late? I looked back at Frank. His gaze was fixed coldly on my phone screen. "Who is it?" he asked icily. Acting on a whim, I silently apologized to CEO Grover and flashed Frank a sweet smile. "My boyfriend." No sooner had the words left my mouth than he yanked me into the car. In the pitch-black darkness, Frank leaned close, his voice low and soft. "Miranda, don't joke around. I'm your boyfriend." Chapter 3. I came to the Dalton family's house when I was 7. My mother worked as a maid for the Daltons. After my father passed away, she brought me to Hong Kong. She couldn't bear to leave her well-paying job at the Daltons, nor could she trust leaving me with relatives. Caught between these choices, Frank's grandmother heard about our situation and allowed my mother to bring me into the Dalton household. So, I ended up living with my mother at the Daltons' home. The first time I met Frank was on a perfectly ordinary afternoon, my first week in the Dalton household. My mom was dusting vases in the living room. I just finished washing a cloth for her when I ran into Frank, who had just returned from school. The proud young master eyed the newcomer to his territory with suspicion until his grandmother came downstairs and introduced me. The 6-year-old boy asked casually, "Why doesn't she go to school?" As if worried he might say, "If she doesn't have to go to school, then I won't either." Frank's grandmother quickly added, "She'll start tomorrow." The next day, I was enrolled in the elite kindergarten with the young master. My mother repeatedly reminded me not to offend Frank. The Daltons, 2 heads of the household, were usually so busy with work that we rarely saw them all year. Frank was doted on by his grandmother, treated as though he were fragile and precious. If I upset the young master, we'd both be thrown out of the Dalton home. So, I didn't dare speak to him, afraid that one wrong word might displease him. Once, after school, he suddenly pulled me aside, looking puzzled. "Are you mute?" My grandmother had a fiery personality, and I'd picked up a bit of her spirit growing up with her, so I blurted out, "I'm your mom." Frank stared at me, wide-eyed and confused, his soft little face full of bewilderment. The words had barely left my mouth before I regretted them. I wished I could smack him into forgetting what I'd said. Was my mother about to lose her job? Would I be in big trouble? After a moment, he pouted and said, "No one's ever scolded me before." To my relief, I didn't end up in trouble and my mother kept her job. Instead, Frank started talking to me more. During recess, he'd hand me a chocolate bar, lifting his chin and saying arrogantly, "I couldn't finish this. Here, have some." I'd quickly take it. It was the best chocolate I'd ever tasted, melting in my mouth, sweet but not overly so. I almost wanted to swallow my tongue with it. "Is it good?" he asked. I nodded vigorously. Mmm. He watched me, grinning and flashing a row of tiny white teeth, completely forgetting he'd only given it to me as leftovers. Excitedly, he said, "I'll get you more next time." And so, despite the massive social divide between us, we became good friends. Knowing Frank for over a decade, I'd always thought he had a tough exterior but a soft heart. I never expected that the lips I'd once kissed and that had whispered the sweetest words to me could also say the most hurtful things. Chapter 4. That was the darkest period of my life. By then, my mother no longer worked for the Daltons. She'd planned to use her savings to open a breakfast shop, but while looking at a potential location, she suddenly collapsed from a severe headache. At the hospital, they found something in her brain. To know exactly what it was, she'd need further tests. My heart felt like it was in my throat. Waiting for the results was torture, every second dragged on. I was desperate to see Frank. But his phone was always busy, and our little home was empty and quiet. It was as if he had vanished from my life. I'd lost all contact with him. I didn't understand. Even if he wanted to break up, couldn't he leave me with at least a few words? I reached out to Frank's friends, hoping they could tell me something about him. Frank's friends were just like him, their politeness was only skin deep, barely concealing the cold indifference beneath. Hasn't Frank contacted you these past few days? She was the daughter of one of Frank's uncles, dressed head to toe in luxury brands that I couldn't afford even with a year's salary. She exuded an aura of refined wealth. No, he hasn't, I replied. Susan smiled enigmatically, pulling an invitation out of her bag. Tomorrow's Frank's birthday at the Royal Loft. If you're free, you're welcome to join us. They had their world, and I had my own sense of accomplishment. My confidence came from my perfect GPA, my national scholarship awards, and the job offers I'd received from top companies even before graduation. I'd never thought I was inferior to anyone, nor did I feel unworthy of Frank. But somehow, standing there, I felt my face burning with embarrassment. I stared at the invitation for several minutes before stiffly taking it. Thank you. She stood up, elegantly brushing her hair back. I have a meeting at the office soon, so I'll be heading out. Frank's birthday party was at 7 in the evening, but I sat by my mother's hospital bed, awkwardly peeling an apple. I managed to turn a perfectly round apple into something misshapen, full of cuts and gouges. My mother smiled as she took it from me. After a bite, as if remembering something, she asked, "Isn't it the young master's birthday tonight?" She'd worked for the Dalton family for over 20 years and still hadn't shaken the habit of calling him the young master. "Yeah," I replied. "You two fought, didn't you?" I forced a smile. "Mom, we haven't spoken in half a month. I think he probably wants to break up." She stayed silent for a moment, then reached over, gently touching my head. "Sweetheart, you've known each other for over a decade. No one understands him better than you do. Whatever it is, you need to talk it out in person. Go on. Don't leave any room for regrets." With a small push from her, my last bit of hesitation disappeared. I wasn't a timid person, so why was I so reluctant to face this? This wasn't like me. I could accept a breakup, but I couldn't accept an unclear ending. I went back to our little home and found the birthday gift I'd prepared long ago, a painting. In the painting was the scene of the day he confessed to me, when we were both 18. The young master, blushing for the first time ever, had nervously held my hand. It was also the first time I'd drawn him. We'd learned to paint together. He'd wanted to do everything with me back then, so his grandmother had hired a teacher for both of us. I didn't have a talent for painting, and he'd always said my art was ugly, yet he kept every piece I'd ever given him. Once in middle school, I'd gifted a landscape drawing to my desk mate for their birthday, and Frank had sulked for days until I took it back. Almost all of our memories were beautiful, I just never expected that this beauty would be ripped apart in the most painful way. In an outdated dress, holding a carefully wrapped but inexpensive gift, I stepped into a world where I didn't belong. Frank stood at the center like a prince, surrounded by admirers, exuding elegance. He casually said, "How could I ever love a servant's daughter? It was just for fun." Susan seemed to notice me, she glanced over with disdain before turning away, clinking glasses with Frank. The crisp sound of glass meeting glass felt like a dagger to my heart, each laugh piercing me, and that once familiar face now appeared grotesque. I stumbled out, ripping the painting to shreds and tossing it in the trash. I also tore up every drawing he'd saved of mine. Then I received a call from the hospital and rushed over in disarray. No miracle happened for my mother, I faced the worst outcome. The thought of losing her felt like my world was shattering, but I couldn't afford to collapse. As long as there was a sliver of hope, I wouldn't give up. My mother gripped my hand, seeing through my calm facade to the turmoil underneath. As if she understood something, she whispered, "Miranda, I want to go home." The home she meant was in G City. My throat tightened, and I swallowed the lump, squeezing her hand in return. "All right, Mom. Let's go home." As I handled all the arrangements, Frank's mother found me. She had approached me when she first learned about my relationship with Frank, looking down on me with undisguised contempt. This was the second time. I looked at the check she handed me, accepted it, and sincerely said, "Thank you. I'll be leaving Hong Kong." The first time I saw a check like this, I found it absurd. I couldn't believe a scene straight out of a cliché romance novel could happen to me. Now, I only felt grateful. This money could cover my mother's medical expenses, and I wasn't foolish enough to refuse it again. The corners of Frank's mother's mouth lifted as if to say, "See? You were only in it for the money." I remained unfazed. Consider this the reward for playing Frank's game of love. I gave my emotions, he gave his money, and we were even. I took my mother back to G City, changed my phone number, cut off all contacts, and left everything in Hong Kong behind like a fleeing mouse. For the next 2 years, I woke up countless times from nightmares, haunted by Frank's last words echoing in my ears. That sentence became a recurring nightmare, entangling me relentlessly. Now, hearing him say it again in the darkness was like the nightmare coming back to life. I don't know where the strength came from, but I pulled back my right hand and slapped him hard, my voice chillingly calm. "And you think you have the right to say that? A married couple separated for 2 years can get divorced. At best, we were just playing house. There's no love left. I have a new boyfriend now, Frank. Are you trying to be the third wheel?" Chapter 5. As soon as I finished, his breathing quickened, and he stared at me intently. Under the dim streetlight, his eyes shone brightly, like a predator that wouldn't let go of its prey in the narrow, dark space. I felt a pang of regret. Provoking Frank here wasn't wise, especially since he was far from being a patient man. I had developed earlier than others my age, and in middle school, some boys would gossip about my and other girls' figures during track. At one sports event, Frank overheard them while he was bringing me water. Frank grabbed a glass of water and hurled it at the group of boys, then stood there, watching them coldly. The warm water splashed all over them, and they started cursing at Frank in anger. At the time, I had no idea what had happened. It looked like a fight was about to break out, and I thought about stepping in, but Frank's friends beat me to it, rushing over. They ended up in a small brawl until the teachers arrived to break it up. Before they were separated, Frank threatened them in an icy voice. "Watch your mouths." He looked genuinely intimidating. Those boys were visibly upset, but they didn't dare say anything as they walked away. Right now, I felt like I was facing that same version of Frank. Feigning calm, I glared at him, but deep down, I wondered, would he actually hit me? Outside was just Cliff, his assistant, and knowing his loyalty to Frank, if Frank decided to take care of me, Cliff would probably help hide the body. Swallowing hard, I discreetly reached for my phone, ready to use legal means for self-defense. Ouch. Suddenly, I felt a sharp sting above my collarbone as his teeth scraped against my skin, sending a chill down my spine. "You're insane." I yelped and slapped him again. Without a word, he stepped out of the car. His tall figure stretched under the streetlight, his expression hidden from view. "Cliff, take her back." "Yes, sir." As the car started moving and the streetlights blurred past, I was still in shock. "Frank, just let me go." At a red light, Cliff suddenly spoke. "Miranda, after you left back then, Frank looked for you for a long time. If there's any misunderstanding between you two, it might be best to clear it up sooner rather than later." I sneered, mocking him. "How much did your salary go up, Cliff, that you'd go so far to speak on his behalf?" He fell silent, but after starting the car again, he quietly replied. "Thanks for asking. Just hit 7 figures this year." I should have kept my mouth shut. If I made that kind of money, I'd treat my boss like family, hand-washing his underwear if necessary. Of course, Frank would be an exception. That jerk who plays with feelings, disgusting. The moment I got out, I went straight into the hotel without looking back. This should be the last time I see Frank. With his arrogance, he probably wouldn't want to see me again. But I was still uneasy. Lisa hadn't texted to confirm she was safe, and she wasn't picking up my calls either. We shared a room, so when I went in, I found her sprawled at the foot of the bed, fast asleep, with her phone lying quietly on the floor. Lisa didn't use a password, and as I picked up her phone, I saw it was on the dialing screen. She must have fallen asleep just as she was about to call me. I helped her into bed, and she mumbled, "Miranda, you're back," before turning over and drifting off again. Chapter 6. Our negotiations with the supplier went smoothly. Their initially indifferent attitude turned enthusiastic, and they arranged to show us the factory the next morning. This was a relief. It seemed Frank hadn't sabotaged things behind the scenes. This supplier certainly lived up to its reputation as a sought-after partner in the industry. Every aspect of their production line met top-tier standards. I noted down all the details and, upon returning, compiled everything to report back to the company, which was very pleased with the results. Next came the pricing discussions, but the supplier kept stalling, saying they were still negotiating and asking us to wait. Since we couldn't afford to seem too eager, our manager simply gave us some time off to go explore. Being the shopping paradise it is, we'd arrived in Hong Kong with an endless list of requests from colleagues for purchases. So, Lisa dragged me straight to the biggest shopping mall. The moment we stepped inside, Lisa was like an untamed horse, impossible to rein in, with boundless shopping energy. I hadn't anticipated this kind of a battle when I left in the morning and had worn heels. After just half an hour, my feet were already aching, so I ended up sitting at the G-brand store, waiting for Lisa to finish her shopping spree. Well, if it isn't Miranda. Long time no see. As I was secretly massaging my sore heel, I noticed 4 legs approach, followed by a familiar voice. I froze, feeling exasperated. Great. Hong Kong really is tiny. I looked up with a forced smile. Susan, long time no see. The polite thing to do would be to stand up and greet her, but I didn't bother. I stayed seated, nice and comfortable. The girl next to Susan looked puzzled. Susan, who's this? Frank's ex-girlfriend, Susan replied, tilting her head as if thinking, then chuckling. If she counts as one, that is. The girl laughed, her expression a little condescending. She snorted. Oh, it's her. Not the politest, is she? Hearing this, I knew immediately that these pampered sons and daughters of wealth had been gossiping about me behind my back. I was long past feeling ashamed of my lack of wealth, only finding them tiresome. Given that Frank and I had known each other since childhood, I was supposed to be familiar with his circle too. But our relationship was tenuous at best, since their outings were ones I simply couldn't join. They'd planned skiing trips in Switzerland, diving in Indonesia, yacht parties. It was a rotation of countries for them. I wasn't part of that world because I couldn't afford it. At first, Frank would bring me along. My first time skiing was with him. He took me to the bunny slopes and patiently taught me, over and over. I fell countless times, but he kept helping me back up, and by the end of the trip, I could at least manage a few glides. All my ski gear had been bought by him. I had no idea how expensive it was until I looked it up later, and the price made me quickly return everything. When my mom found out, she warned me not to take things for granted, and not to accept what wasn't mine. So the next time Frank tried to bring me along, I lied, saying I was afraid of the cold and almost caught a cold last time. Only then did he give up. Frank's friends would insinuate that I was trying to cling to him, though, of course, they didn't dare say it in front of him. After all, Frank's only fight had been for me. His speech at his 24th birthday party likely put a lot of his friends at ease. Before that, they would merely hint that I wasn't part of their world. And that was true, so I pretended not to understand, maintaining the polite facade between us. They were the ones who started this, so why should I be the one to play nice? I gave a graceful eye roll and said, "My courtesy is reserved for people." The young girl, clearly unused to being insulted, looked taken aback. "What do you mean by that?" I shrugged. "You still don't get it? Seems like that brain of yours is best suited for counting the sun by day and the moon by night. If your IQ is this low, don't bother picking fights with me. Besides, I'm Frank's ex, are you sure I'm not, perhaps, your mom?" She grit her teeth and spat out. Rude, just like a country girl. I raised a fist right in front of her. Not only rude, honey. I can get rowdy too. Keep trying to show off in front of me, and I might just tear that little face of yours apart. The girl jumped back a few steps in fright, and Susan looked at me in surprise, likely shocked that I could have a temper, too. She opened her mouth, about to say something, when a voice cut through. "What are you doing?" I froze, silently cursing my luck. "Frank? Why is he here?" He was in a tailored black suit, holding a shopping bag of some kind. Susan glanced between Frank and me, scoffing. "Frank, don't you think your parents might be a bit upset if they found out you're getting tangled up with her again?" Frank stared at her for a moment, then suddenly smirked. He leaned in and whispered something into her ear. Susan's face darkened instantly. She shot me a complicated look before grabbing the young girl and leaving. I gave Frank a puzzled look. What on earth did he say to her to make her leave so quickly? Frank pursed his lips slightly. "Her boyfriend is a college friend who just started working at her father's company, but she's currently going on blind dates." So much information. And yet. I frowned and said, "Why do I keep running into you? This mall belongs to my family." Damn. I'd totally forgotten that part. Frank knelt down in front of me and took hold of my foot. His hand was cold, and I shoved him away in surprise. "Are you crazy?" He didn't say a word, just pulled a pair of flats out of his bag and helped me put them on. I frowned. "I can change my own shoes." But by the time I finished speaking, he'd already put the shoes on for me and packed my heels back into the shoebox, holding it by his side. He looked at me steadily, a complicated look in his eyes, as if there was so much he wanted to say. His lips parted slightly. "Miranda. What's he trying to pull now?" His gaze made me feel uneasy. I stood up to leave, but just then, someone called out. "Miranda." I tensed and turned around, surprised. "What are you doing here?" How could there be one familiar face after another? Especially him, wasn't he supposed to be in G City? Grover walked over with a warm smile. "The company takes this new supplier search very seriously, so they sent me over to join you." He paused briefly, his gaze flickering over Frank before he casually added. "Besides, I wanted to see you." Chapter 7. We headed to the center of the plaza to wait for Lisa. Curious how Grover knew where I was, I watched as he smiled and pulled out his phone, opening Lisa's social feed. "Left Miranda here while I continue my shopping spree." Read the post, accompanied by a candid shot of me discreetly rubbing my foot at G's store. Well, that explains it. Soon, Lisa rushed over with bags upon bags. When she spotted Grover, her eyes lit up, and she greeted him with her usual exuberance. "CEO Grover, what brings you here?" She screeched to a halt in front of us, eyes flicking back and forth between Grover and me with a mischievous grin. "Oh, I get it, you missed our Miranda, didn't you?" Grover, ever the good-natured one, chuckled and didn't deny it. Lisa, playful as always, seemed completely at ease with her teasing. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Frank standing not far away. I had told him a small, harmless lie just a few days ago, so I decided to just go along with the story. Grover took the bags from Lisa. "Let me carry these for you." "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly." Despite her words, Lisa didn't hesitate for a second, handing him everything. Then, her eyes widened as she spotted Frank, and she looked starstruck, torn between wanting to approach and not daring to. She whispered to me. "Did you see CEO Frank over there? What's he doing here?" "We just ran into him." Hesitantly, she asked. "Should I go say hi?" Afraid she might blurt out something outrageous, I quickly grabbed her arm. "Honey, not recommended." Lisa looked disappointed but nodded reluctantly. "Fine." Since the manager found out Grover was in Hong Kong, he suggested a team dinner in the group chat. We decided to head back to the hotel first, but before leaving, I remembered something I hadn't yet done and asked them to hail a cab without me. I went over to Frank. "Can I have my shoes back? And how much were those flats you bought me?" "I'll pay you back." Frank gripped the bag with the shoes tightly. "I'll give them to you next time we meet." I reached for the bag, pretending to be troubled. Oh dear, what if I don't want to see you again? My boyfriend wouldn't like that. Frank didn't let go, his face tense, his Adam's apple bobbing as if he were holding something back. There was even a hint of grievance in his eyes. I looked at him, puzzled. 2 years ago, he was the one who said we were just having fun. Now, 2 years later, he's the one who won't let go. What does he even want? Is this some kind of game? Annoyed, I let go of the bag. Forget it. Keep it. Consider it a gift. I turned to leave. Behind me, Frank called my name softly, almost wistfully, but I pretended not to hear him and walked back toward Grover and the others. Chapter 8. After the dinner, Grover shared a ride with Lisa and me. He sat in the front passenger seat, while Lisa, as usual, was tipsy and sprawled across my lap. In the quiet of the car, I couldn't shake off the awkwardness of the afternoon. I turned to Grover and said, "Lisa was just joking earlier. Don't take it to heart." Grover turned back slightly, his eyes lowered, the corners of his mouth curving up a bit. What if I did take it to heart? I stammered, Forget it. I know. He shook his head, a smile on his face, and changed the subject. That CEO Frank is your ex, right? I wasn't particularly surprised, it was all in the past. Yeah. When I picked up your phone, your lock screen was a picture of him. It's not anymore. I held my phone up with a serious expression. My lock screen now says, "Work hard, and I will get rich." Grover chuckled in disbelief. I see, a diligent worker. I grinned back. My acquaintance with Grover started by chance when I took my mom back to G-City. I was both exhausted and busy, juggling job hunting with taking care of her. That afternoon, my mom was preparing for surgery, and I had an important interview in the morning. After finishing the interview, I rushed to the hospital. It started to rain, and with so many people waiting for cabs, I decided to take the bus instead. After getting off the bus, I still had a 10-minute walk to the hospital, and without an umbrella, I jogged to avoid getting drenched. That's when I bumped into Grover at the hospital entrance. In my haste to see my mom, I apologized and hurried off, not realizing I had dropped my phone. When I came out to look for it, I saw Grover waiting at the entrance. He approached me as I hurried over and handed me my phone, nodding with a smile. I figured you'd want this, so I waited for you for a bit. That a bit turned out to be over half an hour. His kindness as a stranger warmed my heart when I first arrived in G-City. I suggested we go out for a meal sometime, and we exchanged contact details. Little did I know, before I could invite him, I would see him again when I started my new job. We locked eyes in the elevator, both stunned. He broke the silence first, smiling. What a coincidence. We'll be colleagues now. If it's convenient, I'd like to treat you this afternoon. True to his name, Grover was warm and approachable, genuine in demeanor. He became both a mentor and a friend, and every step of my growth in G-City was tied to him. I felt grateful for him and was clear that I didn't have romantic feelings for him, even though he never explicitly stated his interest. If I rejected him, it would seem overly presumptuous. Chapter 9. The negotiations had stalled, the suppliers' responses were vague, and anyone could see something was off. Lisa grumbled in frustration. Didn't they seem nice when they took us to see the factory a few days ago? What's with the sudden change? Are they just toying with us? I focused on the supplier's background information. The prominent Tianqian group stood out, and I suspected I knew what was going on. I had changed my number long ago, but some things are etched in my bones, impossible to forget. I typed a familiar string of numbers and sent him a text. Is this amusing to you? Unknown number. Come find me. Unknown number. You know where I am. I gripped my phone tightly, nearly grinding my teeth in anger. That self-serving bastard. I could hardly suppress the urge to give him a piece of my mind. Lisa, unaware of what was happening, thought I was just mad at the supplier and trembled slightly. Miranda, I know you've put a lot of effort into this collaboration, but it's just work. It's not worth getting sick over. I patted her head and said kindly. You're right. I just need to clear my head for a bit. Lisa shrank back like a frightened puppy, muttering a barely audible "oh." I called for a car and headed straight to my destination. I knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. Frank didn't reply to my text either, so I hesitantly entered a string of digits, 111000809. The door swung open. November 10th is my birthday, and August 9th is his. He hadn't even changed it. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by an overwhelmingly familiar decor. The decorative painting in the entrance was one I had no memory of, a piece I had torn apart and broken before leaving. Yet, it had been painstakingly reassembled and hung back in its original spot. On the shoe rack sat my high heels that he had taken from me. The couple mugs on the coffee table were the DIY ones we made when I first started dating Frank. The curves of the mugs fit together to form a heart. There was still a yellow sticky note on the fridge, where I had threatened him not to eat my ice cream without asking, or I'd make him sleep on the couch. It felt like time had frozen here, suspended at the moment I left. I ripped the sticky note off, leaving a residue of double-sided tape on the fridge, and crumpled it into a ball, tossing it into the trash. The bedroom door was wide open, and I could hear faint sounds coming from inside. Frank sat cross-legged on the bed in white loungewear, his face illuminated by the bright daylight lamp, appearing cool and focused. He was pasting together the drawings I had torn up years ago on a whiteboard. To his left were the fragments, and to his right, the reassembled pieces. The right side had stacked up into a thick pile. I couldn't tell how long he had been doing this or when he had started. A fire ignited inside me, and I rushed over to knock the board over. Frank, is this really amusing to you? He looked stunned. I'm sorry. I scoffed. You should be sorry. But since your mom gave me money, we're even. From now on, you go your way, and I'll go mine. Let's not interfere with each other, all right? He seemed to have already known I took money from his mom, showing no shock. His gaze was heavy as it bore into me, a stubbornness evident in his expression. I told you I could find you no matter where you hid. I didn't manage to, so you're angry, right? I was taken aback. Memories flooded back to the winter break after middle school graduation, when Frank took me and his wealthy friends skiing in Switzerland. I kept falling, and Frank stood nearby, urging me to get up by myself. Just as I was getting up, my foot slipped again, and I fell. I was furious, sitting on the ground and refusing to get back up. Frank watched me for a while before sighing and helping me to my feet, pinching my cheek. Silly, like a little penguin. I swatted his hand away and shot him a glare. You're the silly one. I wanted to prove myself, to make him see me differently, so the next day, while he was still asleep, I sneaked out to practice. Then, I successfully got lost. The world was blanketed in white snow, and the trees all looked the same to me. I couldn't distinguish which way I had come from. I wanted to call Frank, but my phone had frozen and shut off. I looked around, and it was just me. It was the first time I truly felt fear. I clung tightly to my snowboard, huddled under a tree, praying Frank would find me soon. Just as I was about to lose consciousness from the cold, I finally saw Frank. He came running towards me with a group of people, his face pale. Miranda. For the first time, I felt this kid was so reliable. I wrapped my arms tightly around his neck, burying my face in his chest, mumbling. Frank, why did it take you so long to get here? Frank had grown later than I had, and at that moment, he was just barely my height. It was an awkward position for both of us, but he didn't push me away. His voice was surprisingly gentle. It's okay, it's okay. Don't be afraid. I'm not afraid. I was just worried you wouldn't find me. He warmed my almost numb ears with his hands and whispered. No matter where you hide, I can find you. The sense of security I felt then was so real. The young Frank sheltered me from the wind and snow with his not-so-strong shoulders, creating a small sanctuary just for us. Chapter 10. If our relationship had only remained as friends, would things have turned out differently? But then I thought, when we were just friends, did he ever say to someone else behind my back, "The daughter of a servant doesn't deserve to be my friend"? That night's lesson was too bloody. I felt like a Cinderella who had stumbled into high society. The difference was, Cinderella had a royal background and a fairy godmother to help her. All I had was a gutsy spirit and a shaky sense of self-worth. When Frank's mother first approached me, saying my existence would embarrass him, I felt mortified. But more than that, I was naive, believing love could overcome anything. Frank's words acted like a rope named reality, dragging me out of the sea of ideals and stranding me on the shallow shores of reality. This late nostalgia and emotion was probably because I had lost someone who used to follow me around, and I wasn't used to it. I wondered if I could charm him back a little. But I didn't want to play along. I bent down to grab his collar, forcing him to look at me. "It's all in the past. Why bring it up now? Did I leave too gracefully and make Frank upset?" Frank grabbed my hand, his expression a bit fragile, lacking any trace of arrogance. "Miranda, don't leave me again." I reached to undo his buttons and smiled carelessly. "How about we do what we didn't get to do before we broke up? But don't let my boyfriend know. If you're going to be the mistress, you have to act like one to be cherished." His eyelashes fluttered, as if something inside him had shattered. He pushed me away, his voice trembling. "Get lost." I quickly left, and before stepping out, I turned back and said, "Don't pull any childish tricks behind my back. It's immature and boring." With that, I didn't care what he thought and turned away. Once outside, I received a call from Grover. I told him I'd be back soon, and he didn't ask any more questions. That evening, the supplier quoted a price even lower than what we had anticipated. The boss couldn't stop grinning during the video conference. Originally, our company wasn't supposed to work with a supplier of that level. I had no idea what kind of luck the boss was having. Looking at his smiling face, something flashed through my mind quickly. I didn't catch it, letting it slip by, and turned to meet Grover's thoughtful gaze. Chapter 11. Just a few days after returning to G-City, I received several texts from an unknown number. Frank had picked up that sticky note from the trash and stuck it back on the fridge. He even sent me a photo of the fridge door open, packed with ice cream, all my favorite strawberry flavor. Unknown number. I didn't cheat. I couldn't take it anymore and impatiently replied, "If you keep bothering me, I'll change my number." True to form, he didn't send any more messages after that. Chapter 12. Ever since my mom had a close brush with death 2 years ago, she had become increasingly sentimental. She was always worried that she might suddenly leave, leaving me all alone, so she started to pay more attention to my marriage prospects. During dinner, she served me some dishes and asked, "Miranda, are there any suitable boys at your company?" I mentally groaned, "Here we go again," and I fibbed. "There are suitable girls." She fell silent, not expecting that. A few minutes later, it seemed like she made a decision and slowly said, "Well, that could work." This time, I was the one left speechless. "Wow, Mom, you're really open-minded." Worried that she might take me seriously, I said, "I was just joking." My mom immediately replied, "So there is a suitable boy? Is it that Grover from your company?" My temples throbbed. Wow, she's a logic genius. Grover had visited when she was hospitalized for the first time, claiming it was to represent the company's care for its employees. So my mom had never forgotten him, saying he seemed like a reliable person. That was true, but I didn't feel any romantic spark with him. "Mom, we're just friends." She sighed in disappointment and murmured, "What if you were with that young master?" I suddenly lost my appetite. I didn't tell her the real reason for my breakup with Frank, I just said we weren't suited for each other. My mom had watched Frank grow up at the Dalton household for over 20 years. Plus, back then, Frank really knew how to charm her with sweet talk, so she considered him half a son. In her eyes, nobody could compare to Frank as the ideal son-in-law. Her tone became heavy. Sigh, what if I'm gone and leave you all alone? I felt a lump in my throat. Mom, don't say that. You'll live a long life. Just after finishing dinner, I was about to clean up the dishes when ding ding rang. Resigned, I opened my computer. My mom poured me a cup of hot water and then headed to the kitchen. I was listening to the manager passionately talk about the department's future development plans when a loud thud came from the kitchen, making my heart jump. I quickly put down my computer and rushed to the kitchen. Mom? To avoid disturbing me, she had closed the kitchen door, but when I opened it, I found her collapsed on the floor, cradling her head. Mom. I hurriedly dialed emergency services. My mom was admitted to the hospital again. When she woke up, she smiled to reassure me. Once is a fluke, twice is familiar. We're not afraid. After the MRI results came back, the doctor told me my mom's relapse had turned malignant. Even if the surgery was successful, her expected survival time was only about 2 years. Before entering the hospital room, I wiped my tears dry. I walked to her bedside, looking at her pale face, and smiled. Just like the first time, you'll be fine after the surgery. Chapter 13. My mom's surgery was scheduled for 6 o'clock. I squatted outside the operating room, every doctor who came out making my nerves twitch. The hallway was a bit cold, and goosebumps had risen under my thin sweater. I couldn't bear to leave, afraid that if I did, the doctors would come out. A coat wrapped in a mix of cool breeze and warmth was draped over my shoulders, startling me. I turned sharply to find a pair of slightly tired black eyes. What are you doing here? Frank's voice was hoarse. I heard your mom was in the hospital. That I heard felt insightful, and everything clicked for me at once. But I didn't want to dwell on it, I just pulled the coat tighter around myself. Thanks. I wasn't going to freeze just to maintain my pride. With my mom in this condition, who would take care of her if I got sick? At 10 o'clock, my mom was wheeled out. The surgery had gone very well, but she needed to be observed in the recovery room for a day. When I came back on the third day, my mom had already been transferred to a single patient room, and there was an additional caregiver in the room. She seemed very happy to see Frank. The nurse didn't allow family members to stay long, so I had to leave with him after just a few words. Feeling grateful for his kindness, I didn't want to seem too cold. Aren't you going back to Hong Kong? He should have been quite busy, his phone kept ringing after he turned it on. He didn't seem to care at all and simply silenced it. Hearing my question, he lifted his eyelids, his eyes filled with deep emotions, though his voice was calm. I'm not at ease. I avoided his gaze. Not at ease about whom? Me? Or was it my mom? I didn't ask. A couple of days later, my mom was able to sit up, and Frank took the earliest flight back to Hong Kong that day. Once my mom could get out of bed, an old acquaintance from the Dalton family came to visit. Frank's grandmother had a warm temperament and was kind to the household staff. Otherwise, she wouldn't have allowed my mom to bring me into the Dalton family. Both my mom and I held her in high regard. The elderly lady tightly grasped my mom's hand, her tone filled with emotion. After all these years, how have you lost so much weight? My mom's eyes brimmed with tears. You look younger than ever, ma'am. While my mom took a nap, the old lady pulled me aside to talk. I saw Frank had been here for a few days this week, and when I asked, I found out your mother was sick. Poor child, if you need any help, please don't hesitate to ask. Frank's parents are stuck in their old ways, all about social status and matching families. I'm not an old fossil. I consider you my granddaughter-in-law. It hit me then that the old lady didn't know I had broken up with Frank. How had he managed to keep that from her for 2 years? The old lady looked at me kindly. You two have been together for over 10 years. Frank would jump off the second floor just to see you, how could they not see that? After neglecting their child for over 20 years, they suddenly decide to act like strict parents. It's laughable. What? I was stunned by her words, nearly losing my voice. Jumping off a building? When did that happen? Chapter 14. My mom recovered well after surgery and was discharged 2 weeks later. On the day of her discharge, Frank came again, naturally taking over my mom's luggage. As we entered the community, one of my mom's friends came over to greet her. "You're out. Let's go dance in the square soon. Is this your son-in-law? He's so handsome." My mom smiled broadly, not denying it, clearly enjoying the moment. Frank wore a smile too, appearing gentle and polite, which pleased my mom's friends even more. Once we were inside, Frank paused for a moment. The warm gentleness in his eyes faded, replaced by a sharp brightness as he scanned the room, as if trying to memorize every detail. After my mom went into rest, I hesitated and sat down beside him. "Does your leg still hurt?" He froze for a second, then looked at me intently, his lips parting slightly. "It hasn't hurt for a long time." I felt a lump in my throat, and once again, I was overwhelmed with a sense of heartache for him. The pain he must have endured when he jumped from the second floor and walked out with a fractured leg, how excruciating must that have been? I had learned from the old lady that during the month I couldn't reach Frank, his parents had kept him under house arrest. At that time, they wanted Frank to marry the daughter of a business partner, but he refused, insisting he already had a girlfriend. That's when his parents found out about me. They were humiliated, believing that the daughter of a servant would bring shame to them and the Dalton family. They confined Frank, severing his contact with the outside world, hoping to force him into submission. They even found a way to get me to take the money and break up with Frank, but I refused, and Frank wouldn't budge either. His parents actually kept him locked up for a week until he opened a window and jumped from the second floor into the backyard. After the fall, he fractured his right leg and was hospitalized for 10 days. At that time, the old lady was abroad in a nursing home due to health issues, and when she returned and learned of this incident, she was furious. Only then did Frank's parents relent. That year, he came to me without hesitation. In this moment, I felt a surge of impulse to unearth the rotten wounds and let them be exposed to the sunlight. I heard the choke and timidness in my voice. "I went to your birthday party, and I heard everything you said. I didn't know you'd come. The person I least wanted to hurt was you," Frank replied. In his eyes, there was regret and heartache. He said, "At that time, I wasn't strong enough to protect you. If I showed that I cared about you, they would continue to restrict my movements. By the time I went to find you, you were already gone. For the past 2 years, I've been trying to get stronger. Now I can protect you, so I came to find you." Everything before me blurred, and my throat felt itchy, as if something was trying to break free, a sob. If I had been a bit braver back then and walked up to him to ask for clarification, maybe those 2 years of separation wouldn't have happened. But fortunately, I had also grown, and I had the courage to ask again. "Miranda." He wanted to hug me but hesitated for some reason, just looking at me with such pain in his eyes. I had no reservations and threw myself into his arms, sobbing. "I don't have a boyfriend. You're not the other man." His voice was as gentle as his actions. "I know. The moment I saw you again, I knew." "Then why were you angry?" Frank's tone was particularly aggrieved. "Because you kept saying he was your boyfriend." "He's not, I'm the one who is." I couldn't help but laugh through my tears. Jealous King. Chapter 15. My mom was dancing in the square with a newly met old gentleman, her movements crisp and lively, radiating charm, captivating the attention of numerous old men. She hardly resembled a patient. She once told me that life is short, and whether happy or unhappy, every day should be treated like the last, live to the fullest. After finishing one song, my mom switched partners again. This one was quite a bit more handsome than the last, wearing a black trench coat, his hair silvered and slicked back neatly, like a polite gentleman. For some reason, I thought of Frank. I wondered what he was doing. "Do you want some ice cream?" A voice interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to see a young man sitting beside me, holding a strawberry ice cream cone out to me. "Yes." I took it, biting into the icy treat, the sweet and sour flavors bursting in my mouth. Frank wore a smile at the corners of his lips, his handsome face glowing softly under the streetlights, his lips red and teeth white, looking incredibly tempting. As I watched, my heart raced faster and faster. I leaned in and whispered. Did you sneak a taste of mine? No, he replied. I don't believe you. Not unless you let me have a try. Okay, go ahead. He said. He held my chin gently, and I felt no shyness. Instead, I took the lead. My young master was so good. He really hadn't taken a bite,